So this talk is around my most recent book, which is called Light Rains Sometimes Fall, and I have a copy of it here. And what I wanted to do the very first thing, mostly so I don't forget to do it, and I think it's quite an important thing when talking about books, and we don't often do it, is to talk about, firstly, the cover of it, because the cover is the first contact most people have with a book. They might have heard through word of mouth that something is, but the first thing they'll do is look at it and think, do I like this? And when you are writing a book, you do sometimes wonder what the cover design is going to come up with, and is it going to be okay? And both the books that I've written for my publishers, Elliott and Thompson, I've been very lucky to have the cover designer Clover Robin, who is a fantastic collage artist who also lives in London. And there's a moment in the process when you've handed the book over and you're waiting for things to happen, and then you get an email from the publisher saying, with an attachment, first draft of cover. And it's a very, very nerve-wracking moment, because you just think, oh God, what if I hate it? What if it's completely against the brief? And I'm delighted to say that on both occasions, I've opened the PDF and just sort of sat there grinning for about 10 minutes afterwards. So what Clover's done is she's taken the concept of the book, which is looking at a year through seasonal observation, and she's got as many details about it into the cover as possible, going through the seasons in a sort of circular fashion, but also reflecting nice things about the nature of my local patch, which is an suburban patch. So you can see the high rises, you can see the church, you can see the cemetery fox, you can see the overflowing bins, which is, I think, a nice little touch. So I thought I'd just get that out of the way, because it's really important, I think, for writers to acknowledge that we get all the credit, we get our name on the cover, but publishers and designers and cover designers, they play a huge part in the success or otherwise of a book, and the appearance, obviously. So the next thing really is to talk about how books start, and in particular how this book started. I have been for about 25-30 years by trade a conductor of orchestras, and have turned in the last 10 years or so to writing, which I've had always done as a happy hobby. I've been lucky enough to have 5 books published now, and I'm working on my 6th. And I've learned as I do more books that at any stage, the writing of a book, the process of writing a book, can be interrupted by a most unwelcome thing, which is the idea for the next book. And the idea for the next book usually pops up just at the wrong time, when you're really struggling, and you've really got to, you're up under the cosh, and you've got the deadline to hit, and you're behind the schedule, and you've really got to concentrate on the book at the moment. And then suddenly this other one comes, write me, devote your time to me rather than this thing that you're struggling with. And so it was with this one. I was in the middle of writing, or getting towards the end of writing, Into the Tangled Bank, which was my previous book for Elliott and Thompson, which was a tour of Britain, looking at our relationship with nature, and observing the nature and the people observing the nature, as it were, and visiting the homes of great naturalists, and spending some time on their patch. So that was a book that involved a fair amount of driving around the UK. And while I was doing all that, the idea occurred to me that for the next book, it would be quite nice to stay in the same place, rather than driving around all over the place. So I had also concurrently, or for a couple of years, at the back of my mind and lurking in one of my notebooks, was an idea about seasonality, and in particular the idea of microseasons, which I had come across on Twitter a few years earlier. Some like-minded friends who are interested in nature and looking at things had found this website that had a list of these microseasons, which supposedly originated in Japan. And there are 72 of them, each one about 5 days long, and each one has its own little name. So the idea is that you're marking the year not in broad sweep of 4 seasons or 12 months, but in these very small little packages. So this was an idea that appealed to me. And at the same time as it appealing to me just as a way of observing nature, it popped into my head that actually this would be an appealing thing to make a book of. So you've got 72 very short chapters, and each one devoted to the goings on of the nature in your local patch or wherever it might be. And pleasingly, I suggested it to my publishers, and they pretty much instantly said yes. And also pleasingly, I managed to finish Into the Tangled Bank before I actually started sitting down to write it. So that was that was also pretty good. And the timing of this is slightly relevant to the actual content of the book, because this all happened in 2019. So the idea was that I would spend most of a year not going anywhere very much and walking around my patch in South London, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, and just writing down what I saw and constructing these little essays, I suppose, to make the book. And the Japanese microseason year starts at the beginning of February. So the plan was I'd spend from February 2020 to the end of January 2021, staying very close to home, looking at nature. And of course, we all know what happened after that, which is that towards around this time 2 years ago, the pandemic hit. And so something I was already doing, which was staying at home and looking closely at nature, was rather forced upon us by the first lockdown. And this was not in any way my intention, because I didn't want it to be a pandemic book. But in almost inevitably, it did affect the way I was doing things. So it was that there are elements of that in the book as well, even though, as I say, it didn't want to be something that was, we had a discussion about it quite early on about how, we didn't want it to turn into this huge thing. So there are elements of it in that, but really what it was the interest in this microseason calendar, which has its roots in the word ancient, which does a lot of heavy lifting because it can be quite non-specific, but it has its roots in the 24 solar terms, which were originally thought up, I think, or observed in China, and then made its way via Korea to Japan around the 6th century. And these are, I think, quite a well-known concept of the way of marking the passing of the year according to the solstices and the equinoxes. And that further subdivision, then it's a little bit woolly how that came about, but it seems to have been around in the ether around for a couple of centuries. And whether or not it's a truly ancient Japanese thing, it's something that I think lends itself pretty well to what our idea of Japanese culture, because I think certainly sitting in London, looking at things that we kind of know vaguely about Japan, we have an idea that they have a very close relationship with nature, and that also that there is a certain organization to it, and that they marry this idea of observation of nature with very pure observations, for example, in haiku, of the nature. So there is this sort of, I'm sure it's a false impression, but it was something that underpinned my thinking when I was writing the book and looking at the idea. So the idea was that I would take this concept of 72 short periods and apply it to my local area. It did occur to me briefly that it could be another traveling around the country book, but actually the focus that I wanted to bring to it lent itself very well to it being in a relatively small area. And I was also particularly interested in this idea that our relationship with nature is quite often that it's something that we go off and do, as in we go to a nature reserve to look at the birds, or we might go to a zoo to look at the caged animals, or we might go on a boating trip to look at pods of dolphins. It's something that it's something to go out and do, like going to the movies or going to the theatre, and it's not necessarily an activity that we bring into our daily life. And I was quite keen to fight against this, because even though I love going out on special excursions to see amazing spectacles or in search of particular kinds of birds or whatever it might be, I'm also keen on making the most of what I've got to hand. And what I have to hand is a fairly normal South London, urban, suburban, concrete-ish jungle. But I fairly soon discovered that there's more to it than meets the eye. In the first place, London is pretty good for green spaces in general. I think it depends how you measure it, but it is supposed to be, for a city of its size, one of the top 3 or 4 cities in the world for green spaces. But whether we actually take notice of that is another matter, of course. So the patch is West Norwood, which is not far from Bell House. It's slightly less well-to-do than Dulwich, but it has its moments. It has a high street with a B&Q and about 46 coffee shops and nail bars and that kind of thing. It also has a wonderful cemetery, which is one of the so-called Magnificent 7 cemeteries that were built in the 19th century. They're dotted around London, and they are the West Norwood Cemetery, for me, is the perfect place to go for a walk, because it's about 10 minutes to get there, another 20 minutes or so to walk around it once, and then 10 minutes to get back home. So it's the perfect way to just get myself out of the house. And looking at things that aren't tower blocks or high street shops or concrete and stone. There's also a lovely church just opposite the cemetery, which has quite fantastic horse chestnut in its gardens, and which has also been the nesting spot for a couple of years now for a pair of quite now celebrated peregrine falcons, local celebrities. Very frustratingly, I haven't actually seen them for a few weeks, and I had a message from a friend who lives on the other side in Crystal Palace, in Upper Norwood area, saying that he's seen his peregrines, the ones he calls his peregrines, quite a lot recently. And I think we've come to the conclusion that they're the same birds and that they're now slightly moving away from West Norwood, which is annoying of them. If you walk up the hill from my house away from the cemetery, you come to Streatham Common, and Norwood Grove, which is well, there's the common itself, which is quite a large expanse of grass that goes down to the A23. At the top of it, there's Streatham Common Woods, which is a really quite small fragment of woodland left over from the Great Northwood, which used to stretch all across South London. But it's nonetheless pleasing for that, because it's a place of quite great peace and solace at times, as I found when I visited it during the pandemic. There's also the sort of semi-formal gardens called the Rookery, which is a very peaceful place to sit and just watch people go by and watch the nature go past. And then Norwood Grove, which again, it looks across South London, and there's a fair amount of greenery there. So again, these are the walks that shaped the rhythm of my year. And last but not least, there are all the spaces in between those two places. So there's all the streets and the back streets and the little corners, the unconsidered corners, if you like, where you wouldn't expect to see anything. And on top of that, there's our garden at the back of our house, which was we felt particularly appreciative of, because we, especially in those first weeks of lockdown, knowing how lucky we were to have it. So again, the things that I looked at and observed with more appreciation of what there was. So that's the patch, the setting. And what I'm going to do now is just drop you in with the first of the readings of the excerpts from the book. And it's the equivalent season 2 years ago of the one we're in now. So what I did was I took the names of the Japanese seasons, which are things like East wind melts the ice, or insects awaken. My favorite is bears start hibernating in their dens. Some of them, of course, apply very nicely to a London setting, equally to Japan, because some things are very similar. Other ones, like bears start hibernating in their dens, are not so applicable, obviously. So what I did is I took that idea of making these little poetic names for seasons and adapted them to my own needs. So this one is from the 16th to 20th of March, and it's the 9th microseason of the year. And in Japan, in the Japanese calendar, it's called Caterpillars Become Butterflies. But for me, in 2020, it was Cherry Blossoms in Full Bloom. There is a place not far from here where magic happens. It's a brief, evanescent kind of magic, but if you can catch it, the rewards are plentiful. One cherry tree in blossom offers a splash of prettiness. 30 of them qualifies as a spectacular, the clouds of pink-tinged white, irresistibly festive. The transience of the blooms, the reminder, if ever we needed it, of the impermanence and fragility of life, is part of the attraction. Constant beauty becomes wallpaper. Give it to us for just a few days, and it becomes a special treat. It's not strictly on my patch, but it's within walking distance, and a street full of Yoshino cherry trees is enticing enough for me to alter my normal walking routine. The importance of cherry blossom in Japanese culture can hardly be overstated. The ritual of hanami, flower viewing, has been around for over 1,000 years, finding its expression not just as a group activity, but as a pivotal theme in poetry and art. While it started as an activity for the aristocracy and military elite, it spread to the common people around the 16th century and remains popular today, most often taking the form of group picnics in parks where the trees are common. And while other flowers, particularly plum blossom, have their place, it's the cherries that have become symbolic of the Japanese relationship with nature. So entrenched is hanami in the Japanese consciousness that the progress of the flowering, Sakura Zensen, or cherry blossom front, based on 59 sample trees, is monitored and reported by meteorological agencies in daily bulletins. I like this. I like that an aspect of nature is so deeply instilled in the country's makeup that it features in news reports. And I like that after many centuries, this activity still maintains a toehold in the lives of ordinary people. And while Hanami, along with its siblings Momijigari, leaf viewing, and Tsukimi, moon viewing, aren't necessarily representative of the average 21st century Japanese citizen's own daily relationship with nature, they endure. And we have no real equivalent in Western culture. Activities or lifestyle philosophies appropriated from other cultures, take your pick from Hygge, Lagom, Ikigai, Ubuntu, and quite a few more, have taken hold in the British psyche over the last few years. No doubt one aspect of their popularity is the opportunism of marketing people trying to outdo each other to find the next trend. But there's more to it than that. Perhaps these activities or philosophies somehow represent a better way of doing things, a better way of living that for whatever reason we don't think we can find in ourselves. It's not that we don't have our own forms of stress relief, but maybe we undervalue the importance of having a sit down and a nice cup of tea, or going for a bit of a ramble, thinking they don't quite do the job. My solution, going for a bit of a ramble to do some flower viewing while drinking a nice cup of tea, feels like a lifestyle trend just waiting to sweep the nation. There are many attractions to my local area. Walking down the high street on a busy weekday morning isn't one of them. Buses, cars, and lorries are enthusiastic participants in a pollution-belching competition, and my fellow pedestrians take no prisoners as they vie with each other for limited pavement space. I'm just about to duck down a side street when, through the din, I become aware of a familiar tinkling. Soft and distant, its high frequency cutting through the traffic's bass rumble. There's a goldfinch nearby, and I shan't rest until I've found it. I scan the upper floors of the High Street Parade, trying to locate the source of the sound, looking for goldfinch-shaped irregularities on ledges, silhouettes on rooftops. I do the owl listening trick again, tilting my head one way, then the other. It does the trick, and now I can home in on it. A vibrant little blob 2 stories up on the other side of the road, singing to the world about who knows what. I find the goldfinch's song exuberant and uplifting. Others think it mindless and inane, each to their own. Rather that than a busker belting out a stronky version of Blowing in the Wind, in my view. If I'm aware that I cut a strange figure standing on the edge of the pavement, looking at a building over the road with my head cocked, I'm secure in the knowledge that this is London. As odd behaviour goes, this doesn't even register. I have to quell my evangelistic urge on a daily basis. There's nothing so zealous as the recent convert, and the resurgence of my interest in the natural world in middle age has been like a tsunami, engulfing everything and carrying all before it. I see the people walking down the high street, engaged in their daily routine, oblivious to the tinkling songster above their heads, and I want to shout, "Up there, just listen to it." But while I've become less reticent about sharing my enthusiasm, I also don't want to be known as the local character. You know, that weird bird guy. So I keep my trap shut. Almost as if it senses my watching it and is suddenly overcome by a paralyzing shyness in front of an audience, the goldfinch stops singing and is off, bouncing over my head to pastures new. So that was just one example of the kind of things that I was looking out for. And the approach I took was that I would try and go out as often as possible for a short period. I think one of the advantages of this, of writing the book, was that it almost forced me, because I had to, I had to do it, to do something on a regular basis. I knew that once every 5 days, I would have to go out for at least an hour or so and find something. And even if there wasn't anything that was obvious, then I would be really on the lookout for things that might have changed from 5 days earlier, or something that might not have been so obvious, because sometimes I found what I really noticed was that there's something everywhere to take an interest in, especially if you observe it over a long period of time. And you might find, I mean, to take for an obvious example is a tree that isn't in leaf, and just making a point of saying hello to it, or not out loud, but stopping and looking at it every few days and marking its progress. And of course, this is, particularly this time of year, you can see things changing on an almost daily basis. But even when there's nothing going on in the winter months, you can notice that the leaves on the ground are a particularly shoddy, slushy, slimy mess, or they're they've dried out, or whatever it might be. And I think, without wanting to sort of overdo the beneficial effects of it, because I think it's quite easy to overstate that. Say, all you have to do is look at the trees and you'll be better. There was a very pleasing underlying rhythm to it that became part of my life, and still is, actually. And certainly in recent weeks, with recent events, I've found that a way of just getting my head out of the news cycle has been to go out and just be around nature. And it's almost become a cliche, so I sort of hesitate to go on about it. But it certainly has had its effect. You might have guessed from the reading that I just gave that I know that my principal love is birds, the way I just gravitated towards the goldfinch, and that's certainly true. But I did find also that by broadening the scope and almost forcing myself to look at other things, in particular flowers, which well, I love them. It's my wife who's the garden. She's a garden designer by trade, and she's an incredibly keen gardener. So she's the one who knows all about that stuff. But in order to be able to write something vaguely coherent about flowers, I did have to learn some basic stuff. And I found that with all of these subjects that I knew basically nothing about, part of the fun was discovering them. So that leads into my next shortest reading, which is a few weeks later, and we're in the season. What is the season here? It's called Moths Sometimes Fly, and it's the 26th to the 30th of March. And in Japan it would be first cherry blossoms, but we already had that 2 weeks earlier. And it was one of my, I suppose at this stage, this was the first or second week of lockdown, so things were a little bit somber. And I'd gone to the cemetery in West Norwood just to have a bit of a think, bit of a walk and a bit of a think and a bit of a sit. As I sit in quiet contemplation of the world's woes, my eye is caught by a scattering movement. I'm familiar with scattering movements. They're the bane of my life, because once you've seen one, you're obliged by the laws of nature watching to see where it takes you. And where it takes you is often peering into a mass of foliage, waiting for it to repeat itself. So many missed sightings, an unending torrent of non-identifications. Little scattering movements in general mean butterflies, but this has something different to it. I'm familiar with the handful of early season butterflies on my patch, the pale yellow of a brimstone, the dark shadow of a peacock, the various whites, all butterfly-sized and coloured, even from the merest glimpse. This is small and brown. This is a moth. Moth species are overwhelmingly profuse, My Collins Complete Guide to British Butterflies and Moths has 318 pages. The first 50 are devoted to butterflies. The rest cover the moths. Ominously, the last 19 pages are covered by the title, An Introduction to Micro Moths. You mean there are more? The prospect of identifying this nondescript little flutterer is daunting, but I'm keen for something to focus the mind. Keeping a close eye on its flight path, I follow it, and before long, it settles obligingly on the side of a gravestone, my view of it unimpeded by undergrowth or foliage. Normal procedure at this point would be to take some photos with my phone and work it all out later. But my phone has no battery and I have no notebook, so I'm forced to resort to memory. I examine it. The base of its splayed wings forms a broad W, their colour running the gamut of shades of brown, beige, buff, chestnut, sand, a hint of taupe. Russet streaks blurring, morphing to grey at times, moments of black. These subtleties of shading, so easily overlooked, now draw me in as I try to commit them to memory. And as I look more closely, the moth begins to take on the status of underrated beauty. No doubt a seasoned mother would give it a casual glance before turning to more glamorous subjects, but I'm new to this and easily impressed. Once I'm sure I have the image in my head, I continue with the walk. Faster, less thoughtful. I'm keen to get to the bottom of the moth. Browsing a field guide is a calming process. Page after page of moths, seemingly infinite variations on brown and grey, with the odd eye-catching page of pink or green. A world of its own. I leaf through the pages. Nope, 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 maybe, nope, nope, aha. Pugs. Not the dogs, the moths. There are dozens of them. Slow pug, toadflax pug, slender pug, lead-coloured pug, mottled pug, ochreous pug, and many, many more. Among them, I'm almost certain as I compare the image on the page with the one emblazoned on my cerebral cortex, brindled pug. It's widespread and common, tick. The larva feeds on oak and hawthorn, tick. And the adult is in flight from April to May. Close enough. A small moment of triumph, only dampened by the caveat that, quotes, many pug species are difficult to identify with similar and variable wing markings. If you think bird identification is hard, try moths for size. You'll go running back to birds with open arms. I pondered this brief encounter for a while. It's vanishingly unlikely that anyone else saw it. But for my presence, it would have joined the roster of the myriad lives that pass without observation or comment. Substitute if a tree falls in a forest with if a moth lands on a gravestone. The moth doesn't care that I observed it. It might have been aware of me as a dimly looming presence, but wasn't bothered enough to fly away. It will continue with its life, blindly pursuing its main purpose, to be a brindled pug, and to play its part in the continued existence of brindled pugs on the planet. But on this clear spring morning, it unwittingly made a contribution, however tiny, to the accumulated sum of human joy. So for that reason alone, it holds a special place in my heart. The magic of moths, eh? One of the things that gets anybody who knows about moths, or particularly butterflies, but particularly moths, is the habit of the tabloids to lump all the moths in the category of the clothes-eating moths. So be nice to moths. They mean you no harm, mostly. So the I'm quite often asked when talking about this book, and I'm going to anticipate that somebody's going to ask it, which was my favourite of the 72 seasons. And it's a difficult question. I'm often asked also, which is my favourite British bird? And you kind of say, well, I want to love all of them. But those two subjects do combine in my next little thing. And it's something that I've been aware of for several years, even before the resurgence of my love of bird watching in the last 10 years, which was the arrival every late April or early May of the swifts from Africa. We're just at this point in the year right now entering the migration season, the spring migration, when summer visitors spent the winter in Africa are making their way back, and they'll be here for the summer months, and they will attempt to breed, and they will then fly back to Africa for the winter, which is, it's an easy thing to talk about casually, but constantly astonishing thing to my mind. And of those summer visitors, the ones that I adore more than anything else, I think, are the swifts. Partly because we have them, we're very lucky in that we have them nesting in the houses along our terrace. So we would usually, most years, have 3 or 4 pairs nesting under the eaves of the houses on either side. So to have the close contact with them on a pretty much daily basis through the summer is quite something. So the answer I always give to what is the favorite season is this one. It's season 19. In Japan, it's called Frogs Start Singing. But we do have frogs in SE27, but they don't sing very much. So I've called it Swifts Arrive. You could believe the weather is looking at the ancient calendar and has noticed the name of the new season. It's warm enough to sit out in the sun, not so hot that you retreat into the shade, muttering about how hot it is. It might just be because I've become more aware of the small rhythms of the year, but there is a discernible shift from spring-summer to summer-spring. Goldfinch tinkles, robin chips in. Singing frogs, central to this microseason in Japan, are noticeable for their absence. House sparrows fly up and cling to the wall next door, pecking away at the mortar. If at first this seems like eccentric behaviour, there is method to it. They might be mining the grit from the mortar to hold in their gizzards to help with the breaking down seeds and such like. Or they might be after the calcium from the limestone to toughen up their eggshells. Either way, it's not random. They would hardly expend such energy flying up repeatedly from their perch in a nearby tree and back down again without some benefit. While I'm easily distracted by what a continuity announcer would no doubt call their zany antics, my eye is also drawn to a scene of more understated and slower drama closer at hand. Next to me, a flower pot, the last flowerings of geraniums, pale in the sun. Between 2 stalks, a spider has spun a web of such intricate delicacy, it quite takes the breath away. The spider itself is tiny, species unknown. I tell myself I'll look it up later. I don't. It sits in the middle of the web, patience arachnified. There's the occasional tiny gust of wind, no more than a shiver, enough to send ripples through the web. Hoverflies and other tiddlers flit around, gathering nectar. One flies up and comes within a toucher of being ensnared. I wonder if it realizes how close it came to being spider lunch. This everyday spectacle is easily missed, for simple reasons of scale. Small things are harder to see. And if you're not interested, you can easily go through life without being aware of the microscopic universe around us. Even with that interest fully engaged, it takes an act of will to seek these things out. My noticing of the spider was almost coincidental, a function of my sitting next to it for a while and allowing my attention to wander. And it's not as if there aren't other things to distract. Oh my God, swifts, swifts, swifts! What is it about them? Other birds, many birds, make the journey from Africa every year. Other birds, mallards, to take a deliberately obvious example, are faster, although possibly deficient in the manoeuvrability department. Other birds are in decline, plenty of them in a more parlous state, both nationally and globally, than the common swift. But I hold a special place for swifts. I suspect I'm not alone. They, of all birds, command the attention in flight. Even the sight of one swift, squiggling around high above the house like an excitable parenthesis, has me craning my neck to watch. And when they scream past my office window in tight formation, I give myself over to them completely. What it boils down to is their otherness, that feeling you get when you watch them, that you're getting a glimpse of an alien world. All birds possess it to a certain extent. Swifts embody it. No doubt there's a sense of possession in there too, an unearned belief that these birds somehow belong to me. They happen to spend a portion of their year where I am. Ergo, they are my swifts, not quite the same as other people's. They return consistently on the 6th or the 7th of May every year. Today is the 5th. They're early. And I note with deep satisfaction, they're here in numbers. I see 2 at first, high over the house, and then with a growing sense of pleasure, I see more, appearing in the blue sky as if from a portal. 4, 8, 10. 20 years ago, 10 swifts would have been no more than a smattering. Today, it feels like a glut. Still, small nurses and all that. Behind them, I see a different shape, one that sends me indoors for the binoculars. It takes a few seconds to find it in the boundless blue sky, but a recalibration does the job, and my instinct is confirmed. Broad wings, fan tail, a buzzard, soaring lazily anti-clockwise, then drifting off and away and out of my sight behind the house. There's something thrilling about this kind of sighting. I expect to see a buzzard perched on a fence post by a country lane, not circling over the suburban expanse of South London. But there's no shortage of food for an urban buzzard. Rats and mice famously abound. And the woods a couple of miles east of our house offer that kind of woodland habitat where they might nest. I file the sighting under unusual but not astonishing, make a mental note to visit Sydenham Hill Woods as soon as possible, and return to my communion with the swifts. So I hope that gives you an idea of the taste of the book and what it's all about, and its central thesis, if you like, which I don't want to sort of get over enthusiastic and be too evangelical about, but which is just to try and gently encourage people to take notice of the natural world around them, not to regard it as something that is, requiring special visits, and that it's something that you can do anywhere and at any time of the year, whoever you are and how little or how much you know.